Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a playwright, poet, article writer, performance artist, and workshop host. As a playwright, she has written the play The Good Manners of Colonized Subjects, which is about British colonization of the Indian subcontinent. She also hosts the Faraway is Close creativity workshops. Her name is Shebana Cohelo, and my interview with Shebana will follow the teleportation sound. Before the interview begins, I will let our listeners know that Shebana's response to one of my questions during the interview around the 4.5-minute mark was re-recorded by Shebana after the original interview recording due to technical difficulties during that part of the interview. Shebana Cohelo, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Well, my name is Shebana, and I'm originally from India, moved to the US when I was 12. And the last couple of years, I've been an independent artist for over 20 years, and I'm a writer. I'm a performance artist who does solo plays that mix poetry and dance. I've traveled a lot, and I also facilitate creativity workshops that mix writing and movement for people to feel free to express who they are, and for people to understand as well what has kept them silent.
You've done a solo play titled The Good Manners of Colonized Subjects. Were you the playwright, the solo performer, or both of the play, and what is the play about?
I'm both. I wrote the play and I perform it too, and I directed it too. And what the play is about, it grew from actually a poem I wrote in 2016 about how every time fear arrives or knocks on the door, I just invite it in to have some tea. And I sit there frozen with fear. And even when the dancers come knocking on the door, I say, no, I can't leave. I'm having tea with fear. And, all the arts, everything inviting me to express myself comes knocking on the door. And I say, no, I cannot leave. And I realized that when I looked at the poem, that it wanted to be performed. And two, actually, because it brought up some of my childhood growing up in India and some of the things like tea that was a remnant of the British colonization of India, I realized the poem was part of a larger story about the insidious effects of colonization in a very felt body way. Like, the British left India in 1947. So it's quite young, actually, and what that impact was about. And then I realized that it connected to immigration as well. So basically the play is a memoir of kinds, you might say, of my journey to understanding things that kept me in boxes, made of fears and made of things that kept me silent. And it's also about how I found my voice, how I found my way to a kind of liberation.
There's videos about the subject of the British leaving India in 1947 on YouTube. And what they did, they had some lawyer who never visited India in his life draw up a map to partition India between what was then two countries, although one of the countries that got drawn up, Pakistan, is now Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that whole region of the world is still living with the consequences of the British leaving hastily.
Yeah, it's so complicated. But what you say is that the Indian subcontinent got divided actually twice. First in 1947, when it was made into two countries, India and Pakistan. And then in the 1970s, a bit of Pakistan was further divided and became Bangladesh. So, for example, you could have been at one point, depending on when you were born, and I've known people whose parents were, they were born, say, in India, what was then India, and then they could have become a citizen of Pakistan, and then they could have become a citizen of Bangladesh. And these hastily or like thoughtlessly drawn borders or that created countries quickly. I mean, we're still seeing the impact of it all over the world.
Why do you feel that the topics of colonization and creativity are connected?
To answer that question, I'm going to go back a little bit in history to just talk to you about the colonization of India. The British were there for 100 years. That's what my play is primarily about, is the impact of the British and Portuguese India colonization of India, but in a felt body sense. So one of the things that happened was there was a debate as when India was part of the British Empire on how to educate Indians. Do you let Indians learn their own languages or do you teach them English? And in the end, the British decided on English, and what convinced them was a treatise on education by someone called Thomas Babington Macaulay. It's called A Minute on Education, and it says something like, we must create a buffer class, a class of Indians who are Indian in blood and color, but English in intellect and morals and values. So a created class that would help manage the chaos of India, and I come from that class. So I grew up speaking English as my first language, and this created class was taught, or the subtext, and not even the subtext, but the idea was that by speaking English, you are better than other Indians. So what that does over generations is create a class that is not connected to its own society, that it's a class apart. And what another thing colonization does, like another insidious thing that's part of my journey, is excavating it in a felt body sense, in a very personal sense. The colonizers, you have their standards of beauty that you're judging yourself again. So you're thinking, I look in the mirror and be a brown girl with wide hips is, you don't think that's beautiful. And that's part of what colonization has done to places all around the world. It's messed with the indigenous cultures of that place. Trevor Noah has a great quote. The former host of The Daily Show, he says, the colonizers came and they invaded a country and they took everything. And on top of everything, they made you be like them. So it creates all kinds of, like I say in the play, I find I speak easiest when it's easier for me to speak in poetry and dance sometimes than to explain. But the overall feeling is that I say in the play, it stopped something. Colonization stopped something that was in the earth, wanting to reach up into you and connect you to a root, And but I also see colonization as a metaphor for all kinds of things that keep us stuck in boxes not of our making. And the reason I think creativity is connected, because creativity is an expression of true self, creativity and the power of the imagination. We begin to express who we are, especially when we use the language of the senses and metaphor and poetry. I feel that it begins to release things that are stuck in our body. And it protects our vulnerability, even as it allows us to begin to heal and, begin to heal what has been eroding us. So for me, creativity is kind of the antidote, creativity and the power of the imagination, because we begin to recreate ourselves. In many ways, what my play is about is actually choosing a new origin story. Because the place that was colonized, the pre-colonized India, or the pre-colonized place does not exist. There's no place to go back to when you're decolonizing. But through creativity, through stories, you can both express all the nuances of how you feel fragmented, and that begins to heal. And so that's why I feel creativity, especially a felt body sense of it, can be very healing.
I'm going to ask a series of 3 questions as one. How many poems have you written? What styles of poetry do you write? And what motivates you to write poetry?
I don't know how many poems there are, the hundreds. I mean, and I've written in all kinds of styles, but the styles I like best would be kind of free verse or prose poetry, some might call it. Um, I also like really, really short bits of poetry. And what I love about poetry actually is this. What I love about poetry is best described in this quote I heard by a Polish Roma poet named Papuja, and who lived in the 1900s and has now passed. But there was a story about her. She was traveling with a group of nomadic gypsies, and as she was one. And at night they stopped and made a fire, and she began to dance and speak. And there was someone like an anthropologist traveling with them who saw her and heard her and came up to her afterwards and said, "What is this thing that you are saying? What are these things that you are saying? They're beautiful." And she said, "Oh, I'm just saying things that come out of my head." And he said, "Well, do you know that the things that you are saying are poetry?" And she said, "What is poetry?" And so I love this idea of poetry being something that's very natural, that emerges from us when we're moved and want to express who we are.
Some of your poems are available in audio format on SoundCloud, and I'll include, once this episode's up, I'll include a link to the SoundCloud playlist in question in the text description of the episode. But why did you choose to make some of your poems available to listen to on SoundCloud? And do you do the reciting of the poems on your SoundCloud playlist?
Yeah, it's all me. It's all me. And I love the sound of poetry. I love speaking it. It became, I think, as I became more and more of a performer, or I think poetry is another way to find your voice in a different way, to express who you are in a different way. And it just was a natural thing. It just naturally, I was like, oh, I like the sound. I like how it feels to speak the poem in a way it helps me discover new rhythms in the words. And so that's why I began recording them. I kind of like how it feels.
You received a Fulbright grant to travel to Mongolia. A lot of our listeners are going to be familiar with what a Fulbright grant is, but some may not. So, what is a Fulbright grant, and what was it like visiting Mongolia?
Yeah. A Fulbright is the grant I got. It's a very cool grant. It's available to any US citizen. The one I got was a student research grant. So it just meant that you have to be out of college and not have a PhD. And so it's a grant that's given for mutual understanding and to explore other countries. It's very cool, actually, to you get funded to explore your curiosity and have a significant experience in another country. So so I went to Mongolia in 2007, and I was there for a year, actually a year and a half in all. And the grant was to record the sounds of everyday life in nomadic communities. And I also stayed in the city, the capital of Mongolia, which is called Ulaanbaatar. And Mongolia was one of the most beautiful, it was like the adventure of my life. It was one of the most hospitable, open-hearted places I'd been. And like, it really inspired so much of my life afterwards because it's so far away, and you think it's so like you can't even fathom what it's like to be on the steppe, and then suddenly you're on the steppe. You can't even fathom what it's like to live in a ger in a round white felt house, and then you're in that house and you're living with the family and talking about horses, and you're learning a language. And so Mongolia really changed how I lived and my way of living in the world, and it helped. It gave me this phrase that I use to describe all my work, which is called "far away is close," which is this idea that like there's so many things that you think are out of your reach, like being able to connect to people from another country, or being able to connect to your creativity or your writing. But it was a way of saying it's closer than you think. It's available to us all.
In addition to Mongolia, what are some other countries you've traveled to?
Most recently, I was in Ireland and I was in Spain.
You describe your work with the tagline, "Far away is close." What does the phrase "far away is close" mean, and how did your travel and journeys change who you are?
Well, Faraway is close. It just opened me to all the kinds of possibilities, to be open to things like, I was saying, like Mongolia was so far away, but then I was there, and what seemed like far away became like family after a while. So for me, it's a metaphor for things that you feel are so out of your reach, but if you take some steps towards them, they might be closer, they might be than you think. So it's really helped me with my sense of possibility, and to remind me, I wouldn't say everything is possible, but I'm just saying that to take a step closer towards things that you think are just may not be feasible, and see what happens, see if the road softens and rises to meet you.
On your YouTube channel, and I'll include a link to this in the text description of the episode once it's uploaded, one of your videos is titled "Who is the Real Indian?", which is about BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and Person of Color identity. Could you tell us more about that video?
Sure. Well, that video is kind of a monologue that's part of my, it's part of the play, The Good Manners of Colonized Subjects. So I'm talking about just all the little funky, interesting nuances that come with colonization that for example, I live in New Mexico right now. And in New Mexico, there are a whole lot of natives who are also called Indians. But they're only called Indians because Columbus, Christopher, got the way wrong. He thought he was, heading to India and had landed there, but hadn't. And so named it India anyway. And then everyone who happens to be native is called Indian, but really everyone has their own names for themselves. So it's just one of the funny nuances, impacts of colonization. And I also talk about how in that video that, there's all these judgments about about authenticity. And that's another thing that comes up when you come from a country that is fragmented and everyone has different relationships to their own root. So it's just a way to talk about some of the ripple effects of colonization that still are part of our everyday life. It's actually another way to talk about far away is close. It says, you think colonization was something that happened long, long ago in other countries, but it still impacts many people's everyday lives, how they see themselves, how they see others, how they are seen. So that's what that's about.
Yeah, and I'll even add the legacy of colonization will even appear in some functions of governments around the world. For example, in the United States, the U.S. Census Bureau, which is responsible for counting the American population every 10 years for various legal purposes, including apportionment of seats to the U.S. Congress to the states, the U.S. House of Representatives, more specifically to the states. There is on the census form a option for race or ethnicity that is Asian American and Pacific Islander, and that is a very broad group of people with a lot of different ethnic origins and identities.
It really is. It's like, and that's even a month that groups everyone together. I think it's Asian. I forget which month it is, but it's like, and yeah, I mean, it's two different parts of the world, different oceans, entirely different histories. So it's kind of an interesting, interesting thing there.
My final question, what is the best advice you have for people who feel silenced by their own fears?
Yeah, I would say, because fear keeps morphing, shape shifting. And I feel that we need to cultivate kind of a repertoire, a whole bunch of different tools, because you never know what's going to work, to engage with fear. So I would say to know that there are ways to have that sense of like fear is not something that is unmovable would be one thing to say, and the other thing to say was to begin to play with it by first strengthening the parts of you that already feel strong, because I think it's sort of like sometimes if you go straight to the vulnerability, it's and try to get it to stop or something, it's hard that way. And if you can first feel into the parts of you that feel strong or playful or passionate, I feel that's, go more and more first towards what you love, that moment of love in that moment, like to remember how it feels like maybe if you love to write poems, what does it feel like when you're first feeling that feeling of a poem coming to you? You're so moved and you want to write, or when you see a beautiful sunset. So to go into the thing, go closer to what moves you, and from there to approach the fear kind of emboldened by your passion.
Shebana, you were an amazing and interesting guest, and I thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thank you so much for what you do. It's a lovely thing to share your words and to invite people into the worlds and just share their words. It takes a lot of energy to do that. So thank you.
I will include plenty of links to Shebana's work in the text description of this episode, and it was amazing to interview her. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing, reading, and creativity purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2024, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.